The morning mist clung to the fjords like the breath of dying gods when the first dragon appeared over the settlement of Ravenshollow. 15-year-old Eric Ironson was hauling water from the well when the shadow passed overhead, massive and impossible, blotting out the weak autumn sun. The wooden bucket slipped from his calloused hands, water splashing across the frost-hardened ground as he stared upward. The creature's wingspan stretched wider than 3 longships placed end to end, its scales gleaming like burnished copper in the pale light. Steam rose from its nostrils in great billowing clouds, and when it opened its maw, Eric glimpsed rows of teeth longer than axes. "Dragon," he whispered, the word foreign on his tongue. Such beasts existed only in the songs of skalds, in the tales told around winter fires. Yet here it was, circling their village like a hawk above prey. The dragon's roar shattered the morning silence, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of hell itself. Windows shuttered throughout the settlement as families barricaded themselves inside their homes. But Eric remained frozen in the square, unable to look away as more shadows began to appear on the horizon. 2 dragons, 5, a dozen. Within moments the sky was black with wings. Eric's father, Olaf the shipwright, burst from their longhouse, his bearded face pale with terror. "Boy, get inside now." But his words were lost as the first gout of flame descended from above. The dragon's fire was unlike anything Eric had ever seen. It wasn't the familiar orange and red of their hearth fires, but a blue-white inferno that turned stone to slag and iron to vapor. The blacksmith's forge, which had burned continuously for 3 generations, was reduced to molten metal in seconds. Screams erupted throughout Ravenshollow as more dragons joined the assault. The wooden structures that had sheltered Eric's people for countless winters became kindling in moments. The great hall where jarls had once feasted and warriors had sworn oaths collapsed in a roaring avalanche of flame and timber. "The boats!" someone shouted. "Make for the longships!" Eric saw his neighbors fleeing toward the harbor, their arms laden with whatever possessions they could carry. Gunnar the Wise clutched his precious runestones, while Astrid the Weaver dragged her youngest children behind her. But as they reached the water's edge, a massive shadow fell across the docks. The largest dragon Eric had yet seen, a beast whose scales shimmered like black ice, landed on the pier with earth-shaking force. Its claws, each longer than a man was tall, crushed the wooden planks to splinters. When it breathed, the harbor itself began to boil. The longships, those proud vessels that had carried Eric's ancestors across treacherous seas to raid distant lands, burst into flame one by one. The carved dragon heads at their prows seemed to writhe in the inferno, as if the ancient spirits within them were screaming. "Father!" Eric called out, but Olaf was nowhere to be seen. The smoke had grown so thick that day seemed to turn to night. The air itself burned his lungs with each breath. Through the chaos, Eric glimpsed something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The dragons weren't simply destroying, they were organizing. The great black beast at the harbor let out a series of guttural roars, and the others responded in kind. They were communicating, coordinating their attack with an intelligence that chilled Eric to his bones. This wasn't the mindless rampage of wild beasts. This was conquest. A tremendous crash echoed across the settlement as the dragon overhead landed in the village square, its massive form crushing 3 houses beneath its weight. Up close, Eric could see that its eyes held an ancient wisdom, cold and calculating. When those terrible amber orbs fixed upon him, he felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the creature could see straight through to his soul. The dragon tilted its great head, studying the boy with what almost seemed like curiosity. Steam continued to rise from its nostrils, and Eric could feel the heat radiating from its body even at a distance of 50 paces. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, predator and prey regarded each other in silence. Then the creature spoke. Not in the tongue of men, but in a voice that resonated directly in Eric's mind, ancient, powerful, and utterly alien. Images flooded his consciousness. Vast cities of crystal and flame, dragons soaring through skies untouched by human presence, and beneath it all, a sense of righteous reclamation. The age of mammals ends, the voice whispered in his thoughts. The children of fire reclaim what was always ours. Eric stumbled backward, clutching his head as the alien presence withdrew from his mind. Around him, Ravenshollow continued to burn. The acrid smoke of destroyed lives filled the air, mixed with the screams of those who hadn't escaped the initial assault. But as the dragon spread its wings to take flight once more, Eric realized something that made his blood run cold. In all the chaos and destruction, he had seen no bodies. The flames consumed everything they touched completely, leaving nothing behind, not even bones. The people of Ravenshollow hadn't just been killed, they had been erased. As night fell over the burning ruins of his home, Eric found himself alone among the smouldering remains. Every structure had been reduced to ash and slag. The stone foundations of buildings that had stood for generations were cracked and melted. Even the ancient rune stone at the village centre, carved by his great-grandfather to mark the settlement's founding, had been split in two by the terrible heat. The silence was absolute. No crying of infants, no lowing of cattle, no familiar sounds of daily life, just the whisper of wind through the devastation and the distant crackle of dying flames. Eric made his way through the ruins on unsteady legs, calling out names of friends and family. "Father Magnus Helga," but his voice echoed unanswered through the wasteland that had once been his world. At the harbour he found the skeletal remains of the longships, their iron nails and bronze fittings, the only testament to their former glory. The dragon that had destroyed them was gone, but its massive claw prints remained pressed deep into the stone of the dock. As Eric knelt beside the ruined pier, something glinted in the shallow water. He waded in, the cold fjord water shocking his system, and retrieved a small object from the mud. It was his father's silver arm ring, the one that had been passed down through 5 generations of shipbuilders. The metal was blackened and twisted by heat, but still recognizable. Tears streamed down Eric's soot-stained cheeks as he clutched the ring to his chest. In the space of a single morning, everything he had ever known had been swept away. His family, his friends, his entire world, gone as if they had never existed. But as he grieved, a new sound reached his ears. Distant at first, but growing steadily louder, the rhythmic beating of massive wings. They were coming back. Eric scrambled up the rocky slope above the harbour, seeking higher ground. From his vantage point, he could see across the fjord to where other settlements dotted the coastline. Each one glowed with the orange light of destruction. Columns of smoke rose like funeral pyres against the star-filled sky. The dragons were being systematic, methodical. They were wiping out every trace of human habitation along the coast, settlement by settlement, village by village. A terrible understanding dawned on Eric as he watched the distant fires. This wasn't an isolated attack on Ravenshollow. This was the beginning of something far greater and far more horrifying. The dragons had returned to reclaim their world, and humanity was being erased from it entirely. As if summoned by his thoughts, a shadow passed overhead. Eric pressed himself flat against the rocks, hardly daring to breathe. The dragons circled the ruins of Ravenshollow twice before landing in what had once been the village square. Even at this distance, Eric could see the intelligence in its movements as it surveyed the destruction. The creature seemed satisfied with its work. With a sound like thunder, it launched itself skyward once more, joining the formation of dragons visible against the stars. They flew south, toward the larger settlements along the coast, toward the royal seat at Drakmor, where King Harold held court and the greatest warriors of the realm gathered. Eric realized with growing horror that if the dragons could destroy Ravenshollow so completely in mere minutes, what chance did even the mightiest strongholds have against them? He was alone now, possibly the only survivor for leagues in any direction. The familiar world of his childhood had been burned away, leaving him stranded in a landscape transformed by fire and death. But something deep within Eric, some spark of the Viking spirit that had driven his ancestors across unknown seas, refused to let despair consume him entirely. He was alive when all others had perished. There had to be a reason for that, a purpose. As the last dragon disappeared into the southern sky, Eric made a silent vow over the ruins of his home. He would survive. He would endure, and somehow he would find a way to ensure that the memory of his people lived on, even if he remained the last human child in a world claimed by dragons. The Age of Fire had begun, but the Age of Man would not end with him. 3 days had passed since the burning of Ravenshollow, and Eric had learned the harsh mathematics of survival. Water could be found in the mountain streams that fed the fjord, but food was scarce. The dragon's fire had been so intense that it had burned away, not just the settlement, but every living thing for hundreds of paces around it. No grass grew in the ash-covered soil. No birds nested in the blackened trees. Eric had salvaged what he could from the ruins: a partially melted knife, some scraps of cloth that had somehow escaped the flames, and a water skin made from seal skin that had been buried beneath the collapsed roof of the tanner's workshop. Most precious of all was a small leather pouch containing a handful of runes his grandfather had carved, their surfaces barely scorched by the dragon fire. The boy had set up a crude shelter in a cave above the fjord, hidden from aerial view by an overhang of rock. From this vantage point he could observe the comings and goings of the dragons without being seen, and what he observed filled him with a mixture of awe and terror. The creatures were building something. Each dawn brought new arrivals, dragons of every size and color imaginable. Some were small and swift, no larger than eagles, with scales that shimmered like precious gems. Others were massive beyond comprehension, their wing beats creating whirlwinds that could topple trees. But all of them worked with purpose, carrying materials in their claws or breathing controlled flames to shape stone and metal. They were constructing what could only be described as a palace rising from the ruins of what had once been the trading town of Nordvik across the fjord. The structure defied human understanding: towers that spiraled impossibly high, bridges of crystallized flame spanning vast distances, and at its heart a great dome that pulsed with inner fire. Eric watched through his grandfather's spyglass, one of the few objects to survive the destruction intact, as the dragons labored. Their movements were coordinated with military precision, each creature knowing exactly what role it played in the greater design. He began to recognize individual dragons, giving them names in his mind. Ironscale, whose black hide seemed to absorb light itself; Stormwing, whose passage created thunder even on clear days; and most terrifying of all, the Flame Empress, a dragon of such size that her shadow could eclipse entire valleys. It was the Flame Empress who seemed to command the others, her roars carrying across the water with the authority of absolute rule. When she spread her wings, the other dragons fell silent. When she breathed, the very air shimmered with heat distortion. On the 4th day, Eric witnessed something that changed everything. A group of human survivors had appeared on the far shore, refugees from one of the inland settlements, judging by their appearance. They moved cautiously through the ruins of Nordvik, perhaps hoping to find supplies or shelter. Eric wanted to shout a warning, but they were too far away to hear, and any sound might draw the dragon's attention to his own hiding place. The Flame Empress noticed the humans immediately. She descended from her palace like a falling star, landing before the small group with earth-shaking force. The refugees, Eric counted perhaps 20 souls, including children, huddled together in terror. But the dragon did not immediately incinerate them. Instead, she began to speak in that same alien voice that had filled Eric's mind during the attack on Ravenshollow. The humans staggered as the mental contact was established, some falling to their knees, others clutching their heads in apparent agony. Through his spyglass, Eric could see their faces contort with pain and confusion. Whatever the Flame Empress was communicating, it was not gentle. The mental contact lasted for several agonizing minutes before the dragon withdrew. The humans' reaction was immediate and horrifying. They began to change. Their skin took on a greyish pallor, their eyes became flat and lifeless. When they moved, it was in perfect unison, like marionettes controlled by a single puppeteer. The children no longer cried, the adults no longer showed fear. They had become something else, something that was no longer entirely human. Eric watched in mounting horror as the transformed survivors began to work alongside the dragons, their movements mechanical and purposeful. They carried stones, sorted materials, and performed tasks that required human-sized hands and fingers. But they did so without will, without choice, without any spark of the humanity they had once possessed. The dragons weren't just conquering the world, they were enslaving whatever humans they found useful and discarding the rest. That night, Eric made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could not remain hidden in his cave forever, hoping the dragons would simply overlook him. Eventually, they would expand their search, and his hiding place would be discovered. When that happened, he would face the same fate as the refugees, death or transformation into a mindless slave. He had to find other survivors, real survivors who had retained their humanity. And to do that, he would have to venture beyond the relative safety of the fjords, into the interior where the dragon presence might be less concentrated. Eric spent the night preparing for his journey. He fashioned a crude pack from salvaged materials, filled his water skin from the mountain stream, and wrapped his few possessions in oiled cloth. The runes his grandfather had carved would be his compass, their ancient wisdom guiding him toward whatever destiny awaited. As dawn broke over the Dragon Palace, Eric took one last look at the ruins of his childhood home. The blackened stones and twisted metal held 1,000 memories, of his father teaching him to work wood, of summer festivals when the entire village would gather to celebrate the long days, of winter nights when the skalds would tell tales of heroes and gods. All of that was gone now, existing only in his memory. He was the keeper of those stories now, the sole repository of his people's history and culture. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his 15-year-old shoulders, but it also gave him strength. Eric began his journey south, following game trails that wound through the mountains. The higher elevations offered better concealment from aerial predators, and the thin air seemed to discourage the larger dragons from lingering. He traveled by night when possible, using the stars his grandfather had taught him to read as navigation aids. On his second day of travel, he discovered he was not alone. The wolf appeared at sunset as Eric was making camp in a small grove of pine trees. It was massive, larger than any wolf he had seen in the wild, with silver-grey fur and intelligent amber eyes. Instead of showing the fear or aggression he expected, the creature simply watched him with what seemed like recognition. "Hello, old friend," Eric whispered, remembering the tales his grandmother had told of wolves that served as messengers between the world of men and the realm of the gods. "Are you here to guide me, or to judge me?" The wolf padded closer, close enough that Eric could see the scars crisscrossing its muzzle, evidence of many battles survived. When it was within arm's reach, it lowered its great head and allowed the boy to touch its fur. The contact brought visions, not the alien, invasive mental touch of the dragons, but something warmer and more familiar. Eric saw flashes of other survivors scattered across the land, hiding in caves and ruins, clinging to life in a world that no longer welcomed their kind. He saw ancient places of power where the old gods still held sway, sanctuaries that even the dragons might fear to violate. And he saw himself, older and changed by hardship, standing before a gathering of the last free humans and speaking words that would either inspire them to reclaim their world or seal their final doom. When the visions faded, the wolf stepped back and regarded Eric with something that might have been approval. Then it turned and began walking south, pausing to look back as if expecting him to follow. Eric shouldered his pack and fell into step behind his unexpected guide. Whatever lay ahead, other survivors, hidden sanctuaries, or the final confrontation between the old world and the new, he would face it with the courage of his ancestors. Behind them, The dragon palace glowed against the night sky like a second sun, a monument to the new order that had claimed the earth. But ahead lay the unknown, and with it the possibility that the story of humanity was not yet finished. The wolf howled once, a sound that echoed across the mountains like a battle cry, and Eric felt something awaken within his chest, not just hope, but determination. He was the last son of winter, the final guardian of his people's memory, and he would not go gently into the darkness the dragons had brought. The age of fire had begun, but the heart of winter still beat within him, and winter, he knew, always returned. As they traveled through the night, Eric began to understand that his survival had not been mere chance. The wolf's presence, the visions it had shared, the very fact that he alone had escaped the mental domination that had claimed other survivors. All of it pointed to a purpose greater than simple endurance. The dragons might have claimed the earth as their kingdom, but kingdoms could be challenged, thrones could be toppled. And sometimes it took only one voice, one flame of defiance to light the way for others to follow. Eric Ironson, last child of Raven's Hollow, walked into the darkness with his wolf companion, carrying within him the seeds of either humanity's final chapter or its greatest resurgence. Only time would tell which story would be written in the ashes of the old world. Years would pass before the true significance of that night would be revealed. The boy who walked into the mountains with only a wolf for company would emerge as something far greater, a leader, a symbol, and ultimately the architect of humanity's return from the brink of extinction. The dragons had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit, and more importantly, they had failed to account for the power of stories. As long as one person remembered the old ways, the old gods, and the old courage, the flame of humanity could never be fully extinguished. But that tale of resistance and redemption belongs to another telling, another time when the fires of rebellion would burn as bright as dragon flame itself.